man with everything to protect. A father, a pastor, a voice of morality. He stood in the pulpit, his sermons thundering against sin, warning his congregation of damnation. He preached of righteousness, of obedience, of the wrath of God upon those who strayed from the path. To his followers, he was a prophet. To his family, he was law. But what happens when a man so consumed by faith is faced with his worst fear within his own home? When his unwavering belief clashes with the reality of his own blood? His name was Pastor Jeremiah. He built his life on condemning sin, on warning against impurity. But when he discovered his own sons harbored a secret he could not accept, his faith didn't just waver. It snapped. Did he truly believe God commanded him to act? Did the voice of heaven whisper vengeance in his ear? Or was the only voice he heard his own? When love is replaced by fury, when devotion turns to destruction, who is the real sinner? He was a man of faith, a shepherd guiding his flock, a warrior against the evils of the world. But inside his own home, behind closed doors, Pastor Jeremiah Holt became something else entirely, and his sons paid the price. Pastor Jeremiah Holt built his church on fear and absolute obedience. His sermons thundered with warnings of sin, punishment, and eternal damnation. His congregation hung on every word, terrified of disappointing both him and the Almighty. To them, he was a prophet, a man who spoke with the authority of heaven itself. But inside his own home, his rule was even stricter. His wife, Miriam, and his two teenage sons, Daniel, 17, and Isaac, 15, lived under his iron fist, forced to follow his every command. There were no exceptions, no room for individuality. Every morning, the Holt household woke before sunrise for prayer. Breakfast was eaten in silence. Any disobedience was met with harsh discipline, not just from Jeremiah's hands, but from the very Bible he claimed to uphold. To Pastor Holt, emotions were weaknesses, questioning his word was unthinkable, and deviation from his strict interpretation of Scripture was an unforgivable sin. And above all, he abhorred what he called unnatural desires. He preached against them regularly, warning that those who indulged in them would burn in the eternal fires of damnation. Growing up under their father's unrelenting rule, Daniel and Isaac learned one thing early. Their emotions, their desires, even their very thoughts were not their own. Everything they were belonged to God, or, more accurately, to the version of God that Pastor Holt preached about. Every Sunday, their father raged against sin, lust, impurity, the filth of the flesh. He spoke of demons hiding in the hearts of the weak, whispering temptations into their ears, leading them to eternal damnation. But there was one sin he loathed above all, one he called an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. He spat the word from the pulpit like venom. Unnatural. Daniel and Isaac had spent years burying their secret, suffocating it under the weight of Scripture and sermons, of fear and shame. But no amount of prayer could erase what they felt. What had begun as childhood closeness evolved into something deeper as they grew older. Late-night talks turned into stolen touches, into whispered confessions of feelings they couldn't understand. Isaac was the first to speak it out loud. One summer night, when the air was thick with the scent of rain and honeysuckle, he turned to his brother and, in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "I think something's wrong with me." Daniel had felt it too. The warmth when their fingers brushed, the way his chest ached when Isaac cried. But he couldn't find the words to answer. He only pulled Isaac into a tight embrace and held him there, as if sheer force could keep the world from tearing them apart. They told themselves it was nothing, just comfort, just love, the kind no one else could understand. But deep down, they knew. And worse, they knew their father would never forgive them. For months, they lived in fear. Every sermon about sin made them flinch. Every glance from their father felt like an interrogation. They tried to act normal, to suppress the feelings that made their hearts race. They prayed until their knees were raw, begging for deliverance from their own nature. But no matter how much they prayed, the feelings remained. And then, one night, the door creaked open. Pastor Holt stood in the doorway, and everything unraveled. One fateful night, Pastor Holt walked in on the unimaginable. The room was dimly lit by a bedside lamp, casting flickering shadows against the wall. Soft laughter, the kind that had become their secret defiance against the world, was swallowed whole by the sudden creak of the door. And then, he was there. The preacher vanished in an instant, replaced by a man consumed by rage, disgust, and something even darker than sin itself. For a fleeting moment, Daniel and Isaac froze, their faces twisting with terror as the horror settled in. Holt's breath came in ragged gasps, his face contorted in fury. "Abominations!" he spat, his voice a low growl before it erupted into a roar. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his arms outstretched in a desperate plea. "Dad, please, just listen." The slap came like a gunshot, sending Daniel crashing to the floor. Blood filled his mouth, the taste metallic and thick. Isaac lunged toward him, but before he could reach his brother, Holt's fist met his ribs with brutal force, sending him sprawling backward. Then came the drawer, ripped open with such violence that it nearly tore from the frame. The cold gleam of steel caught the dim light as Pastor Holt wrapped his fingers around the handle of his revolver. Isaac's breath hitched. "Daddy, please," he sobbed. "We didn't mean—" The first gunshot ripped through the air like a crack of divine judgment. Daniel jerked violently, his body snapping backward as the bullet tore through his chest. His white undershirt darkened as blood bloomed across it. His mouth opened, but no words came, only a choked, wet gurgle. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed, his body twitching in the final spasms of life. Isaac's scream was raw, inhuman, as he threw himself over Daniel, gripping his brother's bloodied hand, shaking him, pleading with him to wake up. Holt took slow, deliberate steps forward, revolver still raised. Isaac turned his tear-streaked face up to him, his body trembling so hard that he could barely form words. "Daddy, please," he choked out. The second shot silenced him. His small frame convulsed as the bullet punched through his ribs, sending him crashing onto Daniel's lifeless chest. His blood mingled with his brother's, their hands still locked together in death. The room fell into suffocating silence. The scent of gunpowder and blood hung thick in the air. Pastor Holt exhaled a long, shuddering breath and fell to his knees beside them. He closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. God had commanded. He had obeyed. Miriam Holt had been awake when the first gunshot rang out. She'd heard the shouting, the desperate pleas of her children, and the final deafening shots. Frozen in terror, she finally found the strength to run, dialing 911 with trembling hands. "My husband shot them. Oh my God, my babies! He killed my babies!" When the police arrived, they found Jeremiah waiting for them at the front door, his blood-stained hands raised in surrender. "God told me to do it," he whispered, his voice eerily calm. Inside, the crime scene spoke for itself. The two boys lay lifeless, their hands still clasped together, as if even in their final moments, they had found solace in each other. The trial of Pastor Jeremiah Holt was one of the most sensational cases in Texas history. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer who used faith as a weapon. The defense argued insanity, claiming he was under a religious delusion. But it was his own words that sealed his fate. They were sinners, abominations. I cleansed them before their souls were lost forever. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict: guilty. The sentence: Death by lethal injection. Pastor Jeremiah Holt believed he was saving his family, but in reality, he was just another man who let fanaticism consume him. He was judge, jury, and executioner. But who gave him the right? Was he a religious extremist, or was he a murderer using the Bible as his shield?